The analysis of the US-Iran war revolves around three major questions that will ultimately determine the outcome of this conflict and shape the world that comes after it. These three questions are, first, whether the United States will launch a ground invasion of Iran, second, whether nuclear weapons will be used in this conflict, and third, what will happen. Regarding the Al-Aqsa Mosque, each of these questions carries enormous weight and consequence, and the answers to them will define not just the trajectory of this particular war, but the future of global geopolitics, generations to come. Starting with the first question, right now the United States and Israel are primarily engaged in what can be described as an air war, striking Iran from a distance. In historical terms, this kind of warfare would have been called siege warfare. As long as the conflict remains an air war, the United States retains the ability to choose to de-escalate and withdraw from the Middle East. They would lose this war under such a scenario, but the loss would not be catastrophic for them in the long run. However, if they choose to launch a ground invasion, the situation would escalate very quickly, and the United States would find itself trapped in Iran for the next 5 to 10 years. This would be a catastrophe regardless of whether they ultimately win or lose, because in order to fight a ground war of that scale, the United States would have to institute a national draft, forcing young men as young as 18 years old to join the military and be sent to fight in Iran. So the first critical question is whether the United States will send in ground troops. There is also the important concept of mission creep to consider in this context. Mission creep refers to the phenomenon where, in the beginning, a country might say they are only sending 1,000 troops to carry out a limited mission, but when that doesn't go well, they send 2,000 more and then more after that. It slowly creeps upward in a way that is difficult to reverse. This is precisely how the United States found itself deeply entangled in Vietnam. What begins as a small, manageable commitment gradually transforms into a full-scale military engagement with no clear exit. This is one of the most dangerous patterns in military history, and it is very much a live risk in the current situation. The second major question is whether nuclear weapons will be used. There is significant concern, particularly in online discussions and among geopolitical observers, that Israel is preparing a nuclear strike on Iran because the Israelis are dissatisfied with how the war is progressing and are looking for a way to reclaim the initiative. Nuclear weapons represent one of the greatest taboos in modern geopolitics. The Americans used them at the end of World War II, and no nation has used them in conflict ever since. If Israel were to use tactical nuclear weapons against Iran, they would break this universal taboo that has held for decades, and the world could find itself spiraling toward a nuclear apocalypse. This is a concern that many people around the world are grappling with right now. The third question involves the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in the Islamic world after Mecca and Medina. Muslims believe that it is from the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. Jews, on the other hand, believe that the Al-Aqsa Mosque sits on the site of their ancient temple, which they regard as the house of God. Religious Jewish extremists want to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque in order to rebuild what they call the Third Temple. If these extremists were to follow through on this and destroy the mosque, then the approximately 2 billion Muslims in this world would feel religiously obligated to go to war against Israel. The implications of such an event would be almost incomprehensible in scale. These three questions, whether there will be a ground invasion, whether nukes will be used, and what will happen to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, are the defining variables in what happens next. Using game theory as a framework for analysis and working purely from publicly available knowledge rather than any inside information, the predictions are as follows. On the first question, yes, the United States will send in ground troops, On the second question, no, nuclear weapons will not be used in this conflict at this time. On the third question, yes, something significant will happen regarding the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It is important to emphasize that these are predictions based on game theory analysis, and for the analytical framework to be considered valid, all three predictions must prove correct. If even one is wrong, then the entire model must be questioned. The prediction that nukes will not be used comes with a high degree of confidence, 100% confidence in fact, though of course it is acknowledged that if that prediction is wrong, the consequences would be catastrophic for everyone. But based on the game theory analysis, nuclear weapons will not be deployed in this particular phase of this particular war. To understand how these conclusions are reached, it is necessary to explore some foundational concepts from geopolitical theory and game theory. One of the most important concepts in military affairs and geopolitics is the escalation ladder. The dominant conventional theory holds that whoever has escalation dominance has the greatest advantage in any conflict. What this means in practice is straightforward. If two people get into a fight and one has a knife while the other has a gun, the person with the gun has greater escalation dominance and should, in theory, win the fight. Applied to the current war in the Middle East, Israel and the United States have escalation dominance because they possess nuclear weapons, and Iran does not. Therefore, the United States and Israel theoretically have an enormous advantage over Iran. However, the argument being made here is that this conventional theory is actually incorrect. It does not work the way most people assume it does. To illustrate this, consider a simple example of two people getting into a fight. Person A and person B run into each other. A says to B, "Say sorry." B says, "It is not my fault, you say sorry." There is a conflict, and it is usually a very small one where no one is entirely sure who is at fault or why the confrontation started in the first place. From that initial conflict, they start cursing at each other, then they start pushing each other, then they start throwing punches. A fight breaks out, and eventually one pulls out a knife and the other pulls out a gun. The person with the gun should win, right? But what this simple example shows is that the fight is not contained purely within itself. You cannot perceive this situation as a game existing only between two people based on who is physically stronger. There are other players involved as well. There are spectators, friends, a crowd watching everything unfold. There is also the police, who will eventually arrive and ask people what happened and whose fault it was. And for those who are religious, there is even the concept of having to account for your actions before God. In other words, the escalation ladder is driven by three factors simultaneously. The first is emotions. The second is power. The third is reason or logic. What drives people up the escalation ladder is adrenaline. It is essentially impossible to skip steps on the escalation ladder. You do not go from a minor insult directly to someone pulling out a gun and shooting. You have to go step by step because adrenaline is flowing through your system, making you angrier but also making you stronger and more resolved, and also telling you how to fight the battle you are in. The critical insight here is that it is not about how fast you climb the escalation ladder. If you get too angry and overreact, then you are at fault in the eyes of spectators, police, and other observers. What you want to do is climb it strategically. This means you have to remain calm and controlled throughout the escalation process, because remaining calm and controlled gives you three major advantages over your opponent. The first is focus, the second is clarity, the third is resolve. When you have all three, you know what you are doing, you have a clear strategy, you understand how to achieve your goals, and you are determined to see it through. But in order to have all three, you have to maintain emotional control as you move up the escalation ladder. Remember also that it is not just about beating your opponent physically, it is about justifying your actions to friends, to the police, and to whatever higher authority applies to your situation. You might win the physical fight, put someone in the hospital, and feel victorious, only to then spend 10 years in prison. In that case, did you really win? So the law of escalation, which is one of the most important concepts in this game theory model, is this: control is more important than dominance. Control is the idea of calibration. Calibration means that you time, structure, and strategize your response in a way that helps you achieve your strategic objective. You are not just throwing punches randomly. You are throwing a punch in a specific way that allows you to defend yourself, that strikes fear in your opponent, and that allows you to appear as the reasonable party among spectators. And when the authorities arrive, you can justify your actions in a way that keeps you out of trouble. Another way of expressing this idea is that calibration is ultimately about strategic flexibility, and in any fight, the person with the most options and the most flexible strategy will usually prevail. To bring all of this together and apply it to the current geopolitical situation, consider a thought experiment. Imagine a school with a bully who is the biggest kid around and has a gang of 4 friends. Together they prey on everyone at the school, which has around 100 students. They set up a system where everyone who wants to eat lunch in the cafeteria has to pay a tax, maybe $1. The bully's friends go around collecting the money and give it all to him, and he shares it among his gang. At first, people accept this system because they believe the bully is keeping peace and order in the cafeteria, making it safe for everyone to eat lunch. So paying $1 does not seem like that bad a deal. Over time, however, the bully becomes more and more arrogant because he feels invincible. No one challenges him, everyone obeys him, and so he develops hubris, the dangerous belief that because no one has the courage to challenge him, he can do whatever he wants. He starts charging more money from everyone, and he starts paying less to his own friends so that he can have more for himself, to buy a car or take a trip to Paris. Everyone is unhappy about this, but it seems like there is nothing to be done about it. Then one day, a new kid arrives at the school. He does not know the rules. He goes to the cafeteria, does not pay the tax, and when the bully's friend comes over and asks where his dollar is, the new kid simply says he does not owe anything. The bully's gang tries to ostracize him, making him sit alone. The new kid does not care. He is perfectly fine sitting by himself. The gang tries cursing at him, bullying him, calling him names, and asking if he wants to fight. The new kid just ignores them completely. What starts to happen is fascinating. The other students begin to notice that perhaps it is actually possible to resist the bully. Perhaps it is possible to stop paying these taxes. They start quietly talking to the new kid, giving him small gifts, smiling at him, saying hello to him. Meanwhile, some of the bully's friends begin to wonder whether the new kid might be a better leader who would treat them better. Others in the gang start thinking that maybe they themselves should be in charge. All of this internal dissent and rebellion emerges simply because one person refused to accept the established rules and was willing to challenge the assumptions and values of the cafeteria's power structure. Throughout all of this, the new kid does something remarkable. He just ignores everyone and stays focused. Eventually, one of the bully's friends comes over and calls him a wimp, and the new kid finally responds by simply saying he is not afraid. The friend reports this back to the bully, who becomes furious and confronts the new kid, threatening to punch him in the face if he does not apologize. The new kid calmly asks what he should apologize for. The bully cannot give a clear answer and walks away. This happens again the next day and the day after that. Finally, so consumed by rage, the bully throws the first punch. The new kid hits back, gets beaten physically, but now every single person in the school has witnessed that the bully is not as powerful as he seemed. People see his weakness, and they begin to realize that if they stand alongside the new kid, they can defeat the bully together. Ultimately, the bully is defeated. This thought experiment illustrates the key principle perfectly. Yes, the bully has escalation dominance because he is physically the strongest person in the school and can theoretically beat anyone in a fight. But what wins the conflict is not dominance. What wins it is control, calibration, and strategic flexibility. The new kid has many different options available to him and keeps choosing the one that is most strategically advantageous in each moment. The bully, by contrast, has far fewer real options than it appears, because his power is entirely dependent on maintaining face and credibility. His authority rests on the belief that if you do not obey him, he will come and hurt you badly. The moment people see that being punched by him is survivable, that it is not actually the end of the world, he loses all of his credibility. At that point, he is forced into an impossible choice. Either retreat and lose his power entirely, or escalate further and strike harder, which only exposes him more and isolates him further. By calibrating movement strategically, a weaker party can actually manipulate a stronger opponent into a process of self-destruction. This is the central insight that explains what is happening between the United States, Israel, and Iran, and it is the foundation of the game theory analysis being applied to predict the future of this war.